Good afternoon. Thank you for being here today. Last January, I started receiving emails from concerned residents and activists about the procurement process for Philadelphia's new voting machines. The activists talked about a rushed process that wasn't transparent and didn't value public input. There were concerns that the process seemed to favor one vendor, a truly competitive process. We decided to take a closer look. At every turn, there was another question, another concern. Before the city commissioners selected a vendor, I was asking for this process to slow down. As I learned more, it became clear to me that my office needed to dig deeper, not only because of the cost of the purchase at $29 million, but because of what was being procured. The procurement of new voting machines is of utmost importance to electing our leaders and to our democracy. Despite these very public concerns, City Commissioners Al Schmidt and Lisa Deely voted to award the voting systems contract to Election Systems and Software and No Inc. Shortly thereafter, my office launched an investigation into the procurement process for the new voting technology. After reviewing pages of documents and conducting more than 20 interviews of individuals involved in this procurement process, including City Commissioners Schmidt and Deely, my office is releasing the findings of its investigation today. Our investigation identified significant issues with the procurement process. The first city procurement using the best value process put in place in 2017. And I want to say something. I supported Best Value back in 2017 as a new initiative because it's considered a best practice when used correctly. When it's done right, Best Value avoids favoritism and ethical misconduct. It's supposed to be transparent and fair. But that's the key, when it's done right. And this process was not done right. This process was opaque, predisposed towards one vendor, and raised conflict of interest concerns. The key findings from our investigation include ES&S, through the use of a lobbyist, engaged with city commissioners as early as 2013 regarding the procurement of a new voting system. ES&S failed to disclose its use of consultants and its consultants' campaign contributions, including campaign contributions to city commissioners Al Schmidt and Lisa Deely, who ultimately selected ES&S to receive the contract. The city commissioners failed to disclose potential conflicts of interest. City Commissioners Schmidt and Deely received campaign contributions from ES&S's lobbyists in the year prior to selecting ES&S as a vendor. And Commissioner Schmidt repeatedly was the recipient of direct communications with ES&S lobbyists. Both Commissioners Schmidt and Deely signed confidentiality and conflict of interest forms, agreeing not to take official action that impacts their financial interests. And if any such relationship exists at any point, they should recuse themselves. Our investigation also raises a question around if Commissioners Deely and Schmidt were eligible to vote on February 20th when they selected ES&S, as they might have been candidates under Pennsylvania election code and required to recuse themselves from this vote. And I would add, even if they weren't candidates under the election code and required to recuse themselves, they should have done so, because of the perceived conflict of interest. Additionally, the commissioners did not follow the procurement commissioner's recommendation to negotiate with two vendors, ES&S and a second vendor, as well as the same situation for the poll books. Procurement commissioner recommended to negotiate with two vendors. Instead, the commissioners picked only one for each procurement, ES&S for voting machines and No Inc. for poll books. And No Inc. did score lower than 10x on the poll books. Other issues were found regarding the procurement process, including the rushed nature of the official process. Selection committee members feeling pressured to select ES&S, lack of procedures to ensure the integrity of the procurement process, and the lack of overall transparency in the process. We've included some recommendations in our report, including that the city should strengthen the disclosure reviews related to procurement opportunities and should undertake robust reviews of potential conflicts of interest going forward. However, these recommendations address small changes that should occur for the future. I believe that this investigation clearly shows the flaws in this procurement process. It did not encourage confidence in the decision-making being in the best interest of taxpayers. To the contrary, it showed a process that was opaque, was predisposed to one vendor, and raised conflict of interest concerns. Before I take questions, I just want to say one last thing, and that is the wrongdoing the wrongdoing that was found by ES&S around the potential, around the lack of disclosing their use of lobbyists and their lobbyist campaign contributions. Once that was put out to the public last month, and the procurement commissioner recommended to continue the contract, and the Board of Elections voted to continue it, after that point, we did not find any wrongdoing by ES&S. What we did find were issues of not following best value guidelines and processes, not following procurement processes by the city commissioners and the city itself. But because there was no more wrongdoing that we found in our investigation by ES&S, it was determined that as city controller, I could no longer hold the payment to ES&S, and I had to release it. So that is where we stand today. I think this process really did not serve the interests of the taxpayers, and I'm happy to take any questions.
So ES&S still has the contract, they just have to pay that $2.9 million.
That's correct.
Penalty. And then is there any recommendation for actions against the commissioners who were involved?
Well, it's an interesting question because my purview as city controller is to look at the procurement process itself. And what we found was that that process was broken. This information, the 28-page report, as well as additional information that we have, will be available to appropriate agencies to review, to take action if they deem necessary. But I can't recommend a legal action.
When did you release the payment?
The end of last week, I believe.
Explain the penalty.
Sure. So the $2.9 million penalty, which we've been told is the largest in the city's history, ES&S agreed to pay that penalty for their failure to disclose their use of lobbyists. So when on the procurement, in the RFP response, they were supposed to, if they had lobbyists, which we found they did, they were supposed to disclose that they had lobbyists, and they also were supposed to disclose any campaign contributions that lobbyist had given. That none of that was disclosed. The city then had the right to void the contract. The law department determined it was voidable. The city and city commissioners could have voided it at that point back in August. But the procurement commissioner recommended to continue the contract as long as they paid a penalty. And the Board of Elections voted to continue the contract. So they agreed to pay the $2.9 million penalty for their failure to disclose the use of lobbyists and their lobbyist campaign contributions. And I would add there that similar infractions, failure to disclose, has resulted in other procurement opportunities in a complete removal of that vendor from the procurement process. So, the fact that they only paid a penalty, I think, was more lenient than others, but that wasn't my decision.
But they are the only company that has a full-face machine out there, right?
I mean, I can't comment on that if there's another company that has a full-face machine. What I was looking at as my power as the city controller is to look at the actual process and did the city follow the process as outlined in procurement guidelines and the city code, and did they follow ethical rules? And that's what I set out to look at, and that's what I found in the investigation.
Do you find any criminal or ethical wrongdoing here?
I think that needs to be looked at by the appropriate authorities, which we will make it all available to the appropriate authorities. I think,
Who are the appropriate authorities?
I mean, my office has relationships with law enforcement at local, state, and federal level, so we'll be making it available. Beyond that, I don't want to give any more specifics to it because we don't like to talk about that.
When you say that it's you said that the process was predisposed toward a vendor, and that's
Yeah.
something we've heard a lot about with, for example, the full-face ballot design. Are you saying that the process was actually designed in favor of ES&S's express?
Yeah, so let me clarify a little bit because it goes beyond just the full face. What we found was that ES&S, through their lobbyists' involvement in this procurement process, went back to 2013. And what I mean by that is that, and this is detailed out in the report, we obtained emails that, coming from the city commissioner's office, detailing out the commissioner's budget request, saying that, giving 14 examples of different voting machines, and they were all ES&S machines. The commissioner's office only visited places that used ES&S technology. So there's more fact pattern like that in the report that just shows that that there was a predisposition towards that vendor entering the procurement process.
And are you saying, because you said it raises questions of conflict of interest, are you concluding that actually there was a conflict of interest?
So there's one issue, which is the predisposition towards one vendor, and then the separate issue is potential conflicts of interest. It's not up to me to decide whether there is an actual conflict of interest. I think there is enough outlined in the report that it should be looked at. I think that you have the two city commissioners voting to award the contract to the company, and they've received campaign contributions from that company's lobbyist. I think it raises ethical questions, and I think that's something that should be looked at, but I want to stay in the lane of my authority.
And then when you say the process was opaque, like compared to what is the ideal for best value, because isn't part of it that the terms are not revealed until the decision's made?
Mm-hmm. I think the process was opaque in terms of many different things, involvement with the community, many other places, Montgomery County, even Allegheny County have done public demonstrations. There's been a lot more communication between people, the deciding members of the government and the people. I mean, look, this is voting technology. These are our voting machines. I mean, this is like the cornerstone of how we elect our leaders. So there should be more transparency around it.
Well, at this point, could you reassure voters that you didn't find any indication that they have reason to fear that their vote will be counted wrong, or that there's something wrong with the machine, that it can be hacked, or because
Yeah, I mean, that was not the area at all of my office's investigation. My investigation solely looked at the procurement process, and if the procurement process was fair and if it followed city guidelines and city law. I mean, that's what my process was about, because you have a contract of $30 million. It's under my authority to look at to make sure that that payment is justly due. And that involves looking at the procurement process.
So,
But the part of the fallout from looking at the procurement process is there's a lot of distrust about these machines now. Could you reassure voters that they don't have a reason to be concerned
I can't
about their
reassure
vote?
voters about that. That's up to voting experts to reassure voters. It's not my area of expertise.
didn't you find enough flaws in the procurement process to hold this thing up, hold the payment up? I don't quite understand that.
The flaws were related to flaws or wrongdoing by the city itself, by the city commissioners in the city. Therefore, it was determined that ES&S as the vendor, there was no legal justification for me to hold the payment in my authority because it was on the fault of the city.
So you found that in 2015, from these emails, the budget request was developed with support from ES&S. Can you say a little bit more about that? And did you find any sort of way in which ES&S was involved with this procurement process in the development of the RFP, for example?
Development of the RFP, I think, they were not directly involved, but the information about their machines was involved through the communication. And I can't really say more without going into like very specific detail that's in the report, but we could talk afterwards if you want.
Details about the pressuring, you said people felt pressure to select the winning vendor.
Yes.
Can you explain that?
There were, in the interviews that my investigators did with members of the selection committee, there were sentiments shared that they felt pressure coming from the city commissioner's office to select ES&S, that there was more information given about ES&S, that there was some pressure, that they felt that pressure.
In the form of,
Sorry?
can you detail, and the pressure came in the form of?
Just trying to be convinced that that is the best machine.
Was there any involvement with the Department of State in Pennsylvania who oversees elections and the commissioners themselves?
Any involvement of the commissioners themselves. This was an investigation, so they were questioned at length.
Okay, but there wasn't any communication with the PA State Department who oversees elections?
Not around the investigation, no.
Okay.
What do you believe should happen now? I mean, in the past few months, you've called for them to restart the process, but it's getting late. Do you still think that?
You know, I think it's really frustrating, honestly. I think that this process wasn't done right. I think that I'll keep fighting in the ways that I can, but at this point, I think that the information we have will be passed along, and you know, there's not much else I can say. I mean, other than I'm frustrated. You know, I'm frustrated with a process that wasn't done well. With there's a way to do things and a way not to do them, and this isn't the right way to do it. And people deserve more, and I'll keep fighting, if not in this battle and others. But I think that that you know, the conversation will continue.
Is the fine coming as a payment back to the city from ES&S?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Yes.
Did you say how much that final payment was that you released?
The payment that was released.
Like, how much were you withholding originally that you released last week?
It was in the millions. I would have to get 6-7 million, I think, last week.
And you won't object to any of the other payments?
No, I don't have a
Based-
legal basis to. Anything else? Okay, thank you very much.